You have spent more hours than you want to admit, whipping a chain at skeletons, cursing at Medusa heads, and screaming at your TV because some bat knocked you into a pit right before the boss door. Castlevania has been doing that to us since 1986, and somehow we keep coming back. Today, we are going through every single Castlevania game ever made, calling out what each one got right, what it got wrong, and at the end of each one, dropping our retro reality check verdict. 28 games, one franchise. Let's settle this. Before we get into it, if you grew up with any of these games, hit subscribe right now. We do this kind of deep dive every week, and you do not want to miss what's coming next. Drop a comment telling me which Castlevania was your game growing up. I want to see the debate start before we even finish the intro. 1. Castlevania, NES, 1987. Let's start at the beginning. 1987. You pop this cartridge into your NES, and Simon Belmont shows up with a whip and absolutely zero fear of Dracula. The game is a straight-line action platformer, and it is brutally, beautifully hard. Every level feels like it was designed by someone who genuinely wanted to test your patience. The controls are stiff, the enemies respawn the second you scroll back, and those Medusa heads are still the most infuriating enemy in gaming history. But here is what this game got right. It had atmosphere. The music, composed by Kinuyo Yamashita and Satoe Terashima, is some of the best ever written for an 8-bit console. Vampire Killer, Wicked Child, Beginning. These tracks still slap 40 years later. The level design, while punishing, had a logic to it. You learned the patterns, you got better, and beating it felt like a genuine accomplishment. What it got wrong is mostly a product of its time. The knockback system, where every hit sends you flying backwards off a platform, is more frustrating than fun. There is no save system, so you are doing this in one sitting or starting over. And the staircase controls, where you lock into a diagonal path, feel clunky even by 1987 standards. Retro reality check verdict. This is the one that started it all, and it earns its legendary status. It is not the most playable game in the series today, but it is the foundation everything else was built on. If you have never beaten it without save states, that is still on your bucket list. 2. Vampire Killer, MSX2, 1986. Most American gamers have never touched this one, and that is not entirely their fault. The MSX2 was a Japanese and European home computer standard that never made a serious dent in the US market. Vampire Killer came out the same year as the Famicom Disk System version of Castlevania, but it plays completely differently. What it got right is that it was actually ahead of its time. Vampire Killer had exploration elements, keys you needed to find to unlock doors, and a structure that was less linear than the NES game. In a lot of ways, it was a prototype for what Symphony of the Night would eventually become over a decade later. The music was solid for the hardware, and the core whip combat was intact. What it got wrong is the hardware itself. The MSX2 had loading times, the controls felt sluggish compared to the NES version, and the game never got the audience it deserved because of the platform it was on. It is a historical curiosity, more than a must-play today. Retro reality check. Verdict. Vampire Killer is a fascinating footnote that most people skip entirely. If you are a Castlevania historian, track it down. If you just want to play a great game, there are better options on this list. 3. Haunted Castle, Arcade, 1987. Here is one that most people forget exists. Haunted Castle hit arcades in 1987, and it is essentially a coin-operated version of Castlevania designed to eat your quarters as fast as possible. Simon Belmont is back, the castle is back, and the whip is back. But everything is cranked up to an absurd difficulty level, because the arcade business model requires you to keep feeding tokens. What it got right is the visual presentation. For 1987 arcade hardware, Haunted Castle looked impressive. The sprites were larger than the NES version, the colors were richer, and it had a cinematic quality that the home version could not match at the time. The soundtrack was also excellent. What it got wrong is almost everything else. The difficulty is not challenging. It is punishing in a way that feels designed to drain your wallet rather than test your skill. Simon moves like he is walking through wet cement. The hitboxes are generous to the enemies and stingy to the player. And because it was an arcade exclusive, almost nobody played it, and even fewer finished it. Retro Reality Check Verdict. Haunted Castle is worth looking up on YouTube just to see it exist. Playing it today through emulation is a masochistic exercise. Respect it as a piece of arcade history, but do not expect to have fun. 4. Castlevania. 2. Simon's Quest. NES, 1988. Oh, Simon's Quest. This game has been argued about in living rooms and on message boards for nearly 40 years, and the debate is never going to end. Konami took the original Castlevania and tried to turn it into an open-world RPG with day and night cycles, towns, NPCs, and a story in 1988 on the NES. What it got right is the ambition. Nobody was doing anything like this on the NES at the time. The day and night cycle was genuinely innovative. The music, particularly Bloody Tears, is one of the greatest video game tracks ever composed. Full stop. The idea of collecting Dracula's body parts to resurrect and re-defeat him is a wild concept that still sounds cool on paper. What it got wrong is the execution. The NPCs give you deliberately misleading hints. There are puzzles that require you to kneel in front of a specific wall for several seconds, with zero indication that you should do that. The translation from Japanese was notoriously bad, turning useful clues into nonsense. The game essentially requires a guide to finish, which in 1988 meant either a Nintendo Power subscription or a friend who figured it out first. Retro Reality Check Verdict. Simon's Quest is a flawed masterpiece. The bones of something great are in there, buried under terrible design decisions, and a translation that reads like it was run through a blender. Bloody Tears alone earns it a permanent place in the franchise's legacy. 5. Castlevania, The Adventure, Game Boy, 1989. The first portable Castlevania, and it shows. Christopher Belmont makes his debut here, and the game tries to bring the NES experience to Nintendo's new handheld. The concept is solid. The execution has some real problems. What it got right is that it existed at all. Getting a Castlevania game in your pocket in 1989 was genuinely exciting, and the core gameplay loop of whipping enemies and climbing stairs translated reasonably well to the smaller screen. The music, given the Game Boy's limited sound chip, was surprisingly atmospheric. What it got wrong is the performance. The adventure runs at a frame rate that can only be described as struggling. The game slows down noticeably whenever more than 2 enemies are on screen, which happens constantly. Christopher also cannot pick up sub-weapons, which strips out a major layer of strategy from the original game. The levels are short, the bosses are underwhelming, and the whole thing feels rushed. Retro Reality Check Verdict. The Adventure is the weakest of the early Castlevania games, but it gets a pass for being a first-generation Game Boy title. Play it once for the history lesson, then move on to Belmont's Revenge. 6. Castlevania. 3. Dracula's Curse, NES, 1989. Now we are talking. Dracula's Curse is the NES Castlevania game that a lot of hardcore fans consider the best of the 8-bit era. You play as Trevor Belmont, Simon's ancestor, and the game introduces branching paths and multiple playable characters. Grant Dynasty, Sypha Belnades, and Alucard all join your party depending on which route you take, and each one plays completely differently. What it got right is almost everything. The level design is creative and varied. The branching paths give the game serious replay value. The character abilities add genuine strategic depth. Alucard can transform into a bat. Sypha throws fireballs. Grant can climb walls. The music, especially on the Japanese Famicom version with its VRC6 sound chip, is absolutely incredible. The American NES version sounds good too, but the Japanese version sounds like a completely different and better game. What it got wrong is the difficulty, which is even more brutal than the original. Some of the branching paths are significantly harder than others, and the game does not tell you which route is which. The controls retain the stiff knockback system from the original, which by 1989 was starting to feel like a design choice that needed to be retired. Retro reality check verdict. Dracula's Curse is the peak of the classic linear Castlevania formula. If you only play one NES Castlevania, make it this one. The character variety alone puts it above the original. 7. Castlevania. 2. Belmont's Revenge, Game Boy, 1991. Christopher Belmont is back, and this time Konami actually figured out how to make a Game Boy Castlevania. Belmont's Revenge fixes nearly every problem the adventure had, and it does it in a way that feels like a genuine apology to everyone who played the first one. What it got right is the level design. You can choose which of 4 initial stages to tackle first, giving the game a non-linear structure that was unusual for the series at the time. The frame rate issues from the adventure are largely gone. Christopher gets his sub-weapons back. The bosses are more interesting. The music is some of the best on the Game Boy hardware. What it got wrong is that it is still a Game Boy game from 1991, which means it is short, the screen is tiny and dark, and the hardware limitations are always visible. It also does not push the series forward in any meaningful way beyond fixing what was broken. Retro reality check. Verdict. Belmont's Revenge is the Game Boy Castlevania game you actually want to play. It is a solid, well-made action platformer that proves Konami learned from their mistakes. Short, but satisfying. 8. Super Castlevania 4, SNES, 1991. Super Castlevania 4 is the game that made a generation of kids beg their parents for a Super Nintendo. This is a reimagining of the original Castlevania, built from the ground up for 16-bit hardware, and it uses every trick that SNES had to offer. Mode 7 rotating rooms, multi-directional whip control, parallax scrolling backgrounds, and a soundtrack that remains one of the greatest in gaming history. What it got right is the feel. Simon Belmont has never controlled better in a classic-style game. You can whip in 8 directions. You can hang your whip from certain surfaces. The level design is imaginative and varied, with rotating rooms, underwater sections, and a final castle that feels genuinely epic. The difficulty is challenging without being cruel, which was a significant improvement over the NES games. What it got wrong is that it plays it safe. This is a retelling of the original game's story, not a new adventure. Some fans felt that the multi-directional whip made the game too easy compared to its predecessors. And while the graphics were stunning in 1991, the game does not have the replay value of Dracula's Curse. Retro reality check verdict. Super Castlevania 4 is the definitive classic-style Castlevania. If you want to show someone who has never played the series what it is all about, this is the game you hand them. A masterpiece of the 16-bit era. 9. Castlevania, Rondo of Blood, PC Engine, CD-ROM², 1993. Here is another one that most American gamers missed entirely, and it is genuinely one of the best games in the series. Rondo of Blood was a Japan-exclusive PC Engine title that did not get an official Western release until the PSP remake in 2007. Richter Belmont takes the lead, and the game is a love letter to everything that made classic Castlevania great, pushed to its absolute limit on the hardware. What it got right is everything. The level design has branching paths. There are multiple endings. Maria Renard is a fully playable character who plays completely differently from Richter. The animation is fluid and expressive. The music is phenomenal. The boss fights are creative and memorable. This is the pinnacle of the classic linear Castlevania formula. What it got wrong is that it was locked behind a Japanese exclusive console for over a decade. That is not really the game's fault, but it meant that most of the Western audience did not experience it until years later, and by then, Symphony of the Night had already changed everything. Retro reality check verdict. Rondo of Blood is a top 3 Castlevania game, full stop. If you have never played it, the Dracula X Chronicles PSP version or the Anniversary Collection are your best options today. Do not sleep on this one. 10. Castlevania Bloodlines, Sega Genesis, 1994. The only mainline Castlevania game on a Sega console, and it is a genuinely great one. Bloodlines gives you 2 playable characters with completely different playstyles. John Morris, who uses the traditional whip, and Eric Lecard, who fights with a spear and can pole vault to reach higher platforms. The game is set during World War I, which gives it a unique visual identity compared to every other entry in the series. What it got right is the variety. The 2-character system gives the game real replay value. The level design takes you across Europe, from Greece to Germany to France, and each stage has a distinct visual theme. The game pushed the Genesis hardware hard, with impressive scaling effects and large sprites. The soundtrack by Michiru Yamane is excellent. What it got wrong is that it is a bit short, and the difficulty spikes unevenly. Eric Lecard is significantly harder to use effectively than John Morris, which can make a first playthrough frustrating if you pick the wrong character. The game also never got the recognition it deserved, because it was on the Genesis, while most Castlevania fans were on Nintendo hardware. Retro reality check verdict. Bloodlines is an underrated gem that deserves way more attention than it gets. The World War I setting alone makes it stand out from every other game in the series. If you are a Genesis owner who never played this, fix that immediately. 11. Castlevania Dracula X SNES 1995. This is where things get complicated. Dracula X is a Western port of Rondo of Blood, but it is not actually a port. It is a completely different game built from scratch for the SNES, using the Rondo of Blood name and some of its assets. The problem is that it is significantly worse than the game it is supposedly based on. What it got right is that it looks and sounds great for SNES hardware. The music is strong, the visuals are solid, and the core gameplay is competent. If you had never played Rondo of Blood, Dracula X was a perfectly acceptable Castlevania game. What it got wrong is almost everything when compared to its source material. The branching paths are simplified. Maria is not playable. The level design is less creative. The bosses are less interesting. It feels like a budget version of a game that most Western players would not get to experience for another decade. Knowing what Rondo of Blood is makes Dracula X feel like a disappointment. Retro reality check verdict. Dracula X is a decent game that lives in the shadow of a masterpiece. Play it if you are a completionist. If you have a choice between this and Rondo of Blood, there is no choice. 12. Castlevania Symphony of the Night, PlayStation, 1997. We have to talk about this one carefully, because Symphony of the Night is not just a great Castlevania game. It is one of the most influential video games ever made. When Koji Igarashi took the helm and Toru Hagihara produced this game, they did not just change Castlevania. They created an entirely new genre. The term Metroidvania exists because of this game. What it got right is everything. You play as Alucard, Dracula's half-human son, exploring an inverted castle that grows larger as you discover new abilities. The RPG elements, the equipment system, the familiar system, the massive interconnected map, the incredible soundtrack by Michiru Yamane, the voice acting that is so bad it became iconic, the secret inverted castle that doubles the game's length. Symphony of the Night is a game that rewards exploration, experimentation, and curiosity at every turn. What it got wrong is almost nothing, but if you are being critical, the game becomes extremely easy once you understand the equipment system, and the difficulty curve essentially disappears in the second half. The English voice acting, while beloved for its camp value, is objectively terrible. And the game's opening, where you play as Richter and lose immediately, confused a lot of players in 1997. Retro reality check verdict. Symphony of the Night is the greatest Castlevania game ever made, and it is not particularly close. If you disagree, drop it in the comments, because that is a debate worth having. This is the game that defined the series for the next 2 decades. 13. Castlevania Legends, Game Boy, 1997. Castlevania. Legends has the distinction of being the first game in the series to feature a female protagonist. Sonia Belmont predates the Belmont family's canonical connection to the vampire killer Whip, and the story involves a young romance with Alucard. It sounds interesting on paper. What it got right is the ambition. Sonia controls well, the game has a solid structure, and the idea of expanding the Belmont family history was a good one. The music is decent for Game Boy hardware. What it got wrong is the execution and the legacy. The game was later declared non-canon by Koji Igarashi, which effectively erased Sonia Belmont from the official timeline. The gameplay is repetitive, the level design is uninspired, and it feels like a step backward from Belmont's revenge. The game also has a notorious burning mode mechanic that is more confusing than useful. Retro reality check verdict. Castlevania Legends is a historical curiosity that got written out of its own franchise's history. It is not a bad game, but it is the weakest of the Game Boy entries, and one of the weaker games in the series overall. 14. Castlevania, N64, Nintendo 64, 1999. The jump to 3D. Every major franchise had to make this leap in the late 1990s, and not all of them stuck the landing. Castlevania on the N64 did not stick the landing. It did not even get close to the mat, but it tried. And there is something admirable about that. What it got right is the atmosphere. The castle environments look genuinely creepy in 3D, and the game has some memorable set pieces. The story, which follows both Reinhard Schneider and Carrie Fernandez through parallel campaigns, is more developed than most Castlevania games up to that point. The music is solid. What it got wrong is the camera, the controls, and the design philosophy. The camera fights you constantly. The platforming, which is the core of every Castlevania game, is genuinely painful in 3D with these controls. The game has a limited continue system that can lock you out of finishing it if you run out of lives. The fog that covers everything to hide the draw distance is so thick it becomes a gameplay obstacle. Retro reality check verdict. Castlevania 64 is a noble failure. It tried to do something genuinely difficult and did not pull it off. It is worth playing once, just to understand why the series eventually abandoned 3D for 15 years. 15. Castlevania, Legacy of Darkness, Nintendo 64, 1999. Legacy of Darkness is essentially an expanded version of Castlevania 64, released the same year. It adds 2 new playable characters, Cornell the Werewolf, and Henry the Soldier, along with new stages and a revised version of the original game's content. What it got right is that it is a genuine improvement over its predecessor. Cornell's werewolf transformation adds a fun gameplay wrinkle. The new stages are more interesting than some of the original game's weaker sections. If you are going to play the N64 Castlevania games, this is the one to play. What it got wrong is that it still has all the fundamental problems of Castlevania 64. The camera is still bad. The 3D platforming is still painful, and releasing two 3D Castlevania games in the same year, both of which were mediocre, did real damage to the franchise's reputation heading into the new millennium. Retro reality check verdict. Legacy of Darkness is the better N64 Castlevania, but that is a low bar. Play it if you are determined to experience this era of the series. Otherwise, skip straight to Circle of the Moon. 16. Castlevania, Circle of the Moon, Game Boy Advance, 2001. The Game Boy Advance launched in 2001, and Castlevania was right there at launch with Circle of the Moon. Nathan Graves and his mentor, Hugh Baldwin, are trapped in Dracula's castle, and the game is a direct spiritual successor to Symphony of the Night, bringing the Metroidvania formula to a handheld for the first time. What it got right is the card system. The Dual Setup System, or DSS, lets you combine cards dropped by enemies to create different magical effects, and the combinations are deep enough to keep you experimenting for hours. The map design is solid, the boss fights are memorable, and the game has genuine replay value with multiple modes unlocked after completion. What it got wrong is the screen. The original Game Boy Advance had no backlight, and Circle of the Moon is one of the darkest games ever made for that hardware. Playing it in anything less than direct sunlight meant you could barely see what was happening. It is a problem that was fixed by the GBASP, but it made the launch experience genuinely frustrating for a lot of players. Retro reality check verdict. Circle of the Moon is a great game that was hamstrung by its hardware. Play it on a GBASP, an emulator, or the Advance Collection, and you will find one of the better Metroidvania entries in the series. 17. Castlevania, Harmony of Dissonance, Game Boy Advance, 2002. Koji Igarashi took direct control of this one, and the influence of Symphony of the Night is impossible to miss. Justa Belmont, Simon's grandson, explores a castle that exists in two parallel dimensions, and you can switch between them to solve puzzles and find new paths. The game is clearly trying to recapture the magic of Symphony of the Night on a handheld. What it got right is the dual castle mechanic, which is genuinely clever and adds a layer of exploration depth that Circle of the Moon did not have. The game is also significantly brighter than its predecessor, solving the screen visibility problem. The furniture system, where you decorate rooms to gain stat bonuses, is a quirky and fun addition. What it got wrong is the music. Harmony of Dissonance has some of the worst music in the entire series, which is a shocking statement for a franchise known for its incredible soundtracks. The GBA sound chip was limited, but other games on the same hardware sounded far better. The game also feels like a lesser version of Symphony of the Night rather than its own thing. Retro reality check verdict. Harmony of Dissonance is a solid but unremarkable entry. The dual castle mechanic is its best idea, but the music alone is enough to knock it down a few pegs. Play it after Circle of the Moon and before Aria of Sorrow. 18. Castlevania, Aria of Sorrow, Game Boy Advance, 2003. Aria of Sorrow is the best GBA Castlevania game, and it is not particularly close. Set in the year 2035, it follows Soma Cruz, a high school student who discovers he has the power to absorb the souls of defeated enemies and use their abilities. The soul system is one of the most creative mechanics in the entire series. What it got right is the soul system, which gives the game an almost Pokemon-like quality of wanting to collect everything. The story is the most developed of any GBA entry, with a genuine twist that recontextualizes the entire game. The music is excellent. The map design is tight and rewarding. The game respects your time while still delivering a full Metroidvania experience. What it got wrong is that it is a bit short compared to Symphony of the Night, and some of the souls are so powerful that they trivialize the difficulty. The final boss is also a bit anticlimactic, given how strong you can become before reaching it. Retro reality check verdict. Aria of Sorrow is a top 5 Castlevania game. The Soul system is one of the best mechanics the series ever produced, and Soma Cruz is one of its most interesting protagonists. If you only play one GBA Castlevania, make it this one. 19. Castlevania, Lament of Innocence, PlayStation 2, 2003. After the N64 stumble, Konami tried 3D again on the PS2. Lament of Innocence is a prequel set in 1094, following Leon Belmont, the ancestor of the entire Belmont clan, as he fights to rescue his fiancée from a vampire named Walter Bernhard. The game explains the origin of the vampire killer whip and the Belmont family's eternal war against Dracula. What it got right is the story and the lore. Lament of Innocence has the best narrative of any 3D Castlevania game, and the origin story it tells is genuinely compelling. The combat is fluid and satisfying in a way the N64 games never achieved. The boss fights are the highlight of the game, with several genuinely memorable encounters. What it got wrong is the level design. The game reuses the same room layouts across multiple areas, which makes the castle feel repetitive and small. The camera is better than the N64 games, but still causes problems. And the game is significantly shorter than most fans expected from a PS2 title. Retro reality check verdict. Lament of Innocence is a flawed but worthwhile entry for fans who want to understand the Belmont family's origins. The story justifies the playthrough even when the level design frustrates you. 20. Castlevania, Dawn of Sorrow, Nintendo DS, 2005. Soma Cruz is back, and Dawn of Sorrow is a direct sequel to Aria of Sorrow that takes full advantage of the Nintendo DS hardware. The dual screens, the touchscreen mechanics, and the wireless features all get used in ways that feel natural rather than gimmicky. This is the Metroidvania formula, firing on all cylinders for a new generation of hardware. What it got right is almost everything. The Soul system from Aria of Sorrow returns and is expanded. The map design is excellent. The boss fights require you to draw magic seals on the touchscreen to finish them, which is a clever use of the hardware. The story continues Soma's arc in a satisfying way. The game looks and sounds great for a DS launch-era title. What it got wrong is the anime art style, which replaced the gothic illustrations of Ayami Kojima and felt like a significant downgrade in visual identity. The magic seal mechanic, while clever, can become annoying when you are trying to draw a specific shape under pressure during a boss fight. Retro reality check verdict. Dawn of Sorrow is one of the best DS games ever made, and one of the strongest entries in the entire Castlevania series. The art style is a legitimate complaint, but it does not come close to ruining what is otherwise a near-perfect handheld Metroidvania. 21. Castlevania, Curse of Darkness, PlayStation 2/Xbox, 2005. Curse of Darkness is a 3D action game set 3 years after Dracula's curse, following Hector, a former Devil Forge master who served Dracula, and is now hunting the man who betrayed him. The game's central mechanic is the Innocent Devil system, where you raise and evolve creature companions that fight alongside you. What it got right is the Innocent Devil system, which is genuinely deep and gives the game a creature-raising quality that keeps you engaged. The combat is more fluid than Lament of Innocence. The game is longer and has more content than its PS2 predecessor. What it got wrong is the level design, which is even more repetitive than Lament of Innocence. Running through the same looking corridors for hours is a real problem. The story is convoluted in ways that feel more confusing than interesting, and Hector is one of the least compelling protagonists in the series. Retro reality check verdict. Curse of Darkness is a game for Castlevania completionists and people who really love creature-raising mechanics. It is not a bad game, but it is a forgettable one. The Innocent Devil system deserved a better game built around it. 22. Castlevania, Portrait of Ruin, Nintendo DS, 2006. Portrait of Ruin introduces a two-character system where you control Jonathan Morris and Charlotte Allen, switching between them or using them in tandem to solve puzzles and fight enemies. The game's central gimmick is that you enter paintings hanging in Dracula's castle to explore entirely different worlds, from an Egyptian desert to a war-torn city. What it got right is the co-op mechanic, which adds genuine strategic depth. Charlotte's magic and Jonathan's physical combat complement each other well, and the game rewards players who learn to use both characters effectively. The painting worlds are visually diverse and keep the game feeling fresh. The soundtrack is excellent. What it got wrong is the pacing. The game requires you to complete specific challenges in each painting world before you can progress, which can feel like artificial padding. The story is also weaker than Dawn of Sorrows, and the final boss is a bit underwhelming. Retro reality check verdict. Portrait of Ruin is a creative and enjoyable entry that does not quite reach the heights of Dawn of Sorrow or Aria of Sorrow. The two-character system is its strongest idea, and the painting worlds keep it visually interesting throughout. 23. Castlevania, Order of Ecclesia, Nintendo DS, 2008. Order of Ecclesia is the last DS Castlevania, and arguably the best of the three. Shanoa is one of the most compelling protagonists in the series, a woman who has had her memories stolen and must recover them while fighting Dracula, using a system of magical glyphs she absorbs from enemies and the environment. What it got right is the difficulty and the glyph system. Order of Ecclesia is the hardest Metroidvania-style Castlevania since Symphony of the Night, and it earns every bit of that difficulty. The glyph system is deep and flexible, allowing for a huge variety of playstyles. The village mechanic, where you rescue villagers who then provide quests and services, adds a layer of community to the game that the series had never tried before. Shanoa is a genuinely great character. What it got wrong is that the difficulty can tip from challenging into frustrating in certain sections, particularly the later areas. Some of the glyph combinations are so powerful that finding them breaks the game's balance in the other direction. Retro reality check verdict. Order of Ecclesia is a top-tier Castlevania game and the best of the DS trilogy. Shanoa deserves to be in the conversation for best protagonist in the series. If you have a DS or access to emulation, this one is mandatory. 24. Castlevania, The Adventure ReBirth, WiiWare, 2009. ReBirth is a reimagining of the original Game Boy adventure, rebuilt from scratch as a classic linear Castlevania in the style of the NES and SNES games. It was released on WiiWare, Nintendo's digital storefront for the Wii, and it is a genuinely solid throwback that most people missed entirely. What it got right is the feel. ReBirth plays like a love letter to the classic era, with tight controls, great music, and level design that would have fit comfortably on the SNES. It is significantly better than the Game Boy game it is based on, and it proves that the classic linear formula still worked in 2009. What it got wrong is the platform. WiiWare was not a well-trafficked storefront, and the game was delisted when the Wii Shop channel closed in 2019. It is now only accessible through emulation, which means most people will never play it through legitimate means. Retro Reality Check verdict. ReBirth is a hidden gem that deserved a much wider audience. It is a tight, well-made classic Castlevania that got buried by its platform. Konami should put this in a collection immediately. 25. Castlevania, Lords of Shadow, PlayStation 3/Xbox 360, 2010. Lords of Shadow is the most divisive game in the entire series. Developed by Mercury Steam with Hideo Kojima producing, it is a complete reboot of the Castlevania universe. Gabriel Belmont is a warrior of the Brotherhood of Light who sets out to resurrect his dead wife and ends up confronting the Lords of Shadow, three powerful beings who control the forces of darkness. The game plays like a combination of God of War and Shadow of the Colossus, with large-scale combat and massive boss encounters. What it got right is the production value. Lords of Shadow is a gorgeous, cinematic game with a sweeping orchestral score by Oscar Araujo that is genuinely one of the best video game soundtracks of that generation. The combat system is deep and satisfying. The boss fights are spectacular. Patrick Stewart narrates the game, and Robert Carlyle voices Gabriel with genuine emotional weight. The game is a technical achievement. What it got wrong is that it does not feel like Castlevania. The gothic horror atmosphere of the original series is replaced by a more generic dark fantasy aesthetic. The exploration is linear in a way that feels like a step backward from the Metroidvania games. The story, while ambitious, has a twist ending that divided fans sharply, and the game is very long, with some sections that overstay their welcome. Retro Reality Check verdict. Lords of Shadow is a great game that happens to be a mediocre Castlevania. If you approach it as a standalone dark fantasy action game, you will have a fantastic time. If you go in expecting Symphony of the Night, you will be disappointed. Both reactions are completely valid. 26. Castlevania, Lords of Shadow, Mirror of Fate, Nintendo 3DS, 2013. Mirror of Fate bridges the gap between Lords of Shadow and its sequel, telling the stories of Simon Belmont, Trevor Belmont, and Alucard within the rebooted Lords of Shadow timeline. It is a 2.5D game that attempts to blend the classic Castlevania structure with the Lords of Shadow combat system. What it got right is the story, which is the most emotionally ambitious narrative in the Lords of Shadow subseries. The revelation of Trevor's true identity is a genuinely affecting moment, and the game does a good job of making you care about characters who exist in a rebooted continuity. The 2.5D presentation looks impressive on the 3DS hardware. What it got wrong is the combat, which feels stripped down compared to the console Lords of Shadow games. The game is also quite short, and the exploration feels shallow compared to the classic Metroidvania entries. It works better as a story delivery mechanism than as a game. Retro Reality Check. Verdict. Mirror of Fate is worth playing for the story if you are invested in the Lords of Shadow continuity. As a standalone game, it is average. As a bridge between two larger games, it does its job. 27. Castlevania, Lords of Shadow. 2. PS3/Xbox 360/PC 2014. The conclusion of the Lords of Shadow trilogy, and one of the most controversial games in the series. Dracula, who is now Gabriel Belmont, wakes up in the modern world, weakened and hunted by Satan. He must navigate a contemporary city and his own castle, regaining his powers while confronting his past and his son, Alucard. What it got right is the ambition. The modern city setting is genuinely interesting, and the idea of Dracula as a tragic, exhausted figure who just wants to die is compelling. The combat, when it works, is the best in the Lords of Shadow series. The castle sections are visually stunning. What it got wrong is the execution. The modern city sections are widely considered some of the worst level design in the series, with stealth sections that feel completely out of place in a Castlevania game. The game is uneven in a way that feels like it needed another year of development. The story, while ambitious, does not stick the landing in a way that satisfies after 3 games of build-up. Retro reality check verdict. Lords of Shadow 2 is a disappointing end to a trilogy that started so strongly. There are great ideas buried in here, but the execution lets them down. It ended the Lords of Shadow era with a whimper rather than a bang, and the series has been dormant ever since. 28. Castlevania, Grimoire of Souls, iOS/Apple Arcade, 2014/2021. The last Castlevania game released to date, and it is a mobile title. Grimoire of Souls launched in Canada in 2019 as a soft launch, went into wider release, then was shut down, then relaunched on Apple Arcade in 2021. It features multiple playable characters from across the series, including Alucard, Simon, Charlotte, and others, in a gacha-style action game. What it got right is the fan service. Seeing characters from across the series together in one game is genuinely fun for longtime fans. The gameplay is competent for a mobile title, and the Apple Arcade version removed the predatory gacha mechanics that plagued the original release. What it got wrong is that it is a mobile game in a franchise that built its legacy on console experiences. The episodic structure, the simplified gameplay, and the platform all feel beneath what Castlevania deserves as its most recent entry. The fact that this is the last game Konami has released in the series, as of this recording, is genuinely sad. Retro reality check verdict. Grimoire of Souls is fine for what it is. As the current final chapter of a franchise with this legacy, it is a letdown. Castlevania deserves better than a mobile gacha game as its last entry, and every fan of this series knows it. So there it is. Every Castlevania game ever made, from the NES original in 1987 all the way to Grimoire of Souls. Nearly 40 years of whips, vampires, Medusa heads, and some of the greatest video game music ever composed. If you made it this far, you already know which game you think is the best. But here is what I want to know from you. Drop your personal ranking in the comments. Top 3, bottom 3. The one that made you throw a controller. The one you still go back to every October. Let's get a real debate going down there, because this franchise has passionate fans, and I want to hear every single opinion. Is Symphony of the Night untouchable, or does Aria of Sorrow give it a real run? Is Super Castlevania 4 the best classic-style entry, or does Rondo of Blood take that crown? Was Lords of Shadow a bold reinvention or a betrayal of everything the series stood for? These are the arguments worth having, and the comments section is the place to have them. If you want more deep dives like this one, hit subscribe and ring that bell. We do this every week, and next time we are going just as deep on another franchise that defined a generation of gaming. Until then, keep playing the classics, and watch out for those Medusa heads.